Life has a habit of surprising you, just when you least expect it. Sometimes these surprises are good, sometimes not so good, and sometimes they're just, well, odd. Take last Saturday, for instance. I had been planning to have a weekend all to myself. No aliens, no deadlines, no bills, no Luke or Clyde or Rani. Just me, my slippers, and an awful lot of tea, and possibly a little bit of work on the side for when I got restless. The school had organised a geography field trip, you see, a week camping in the heart of Snowdonia, looking at rock formations, oxbow lakes, that sort of thing. Which of course meant Luke, that's my son, and his friends wouldn't be around, and I'd finally have the chance to catch up on a few of those boring, real-life things. Funny, really, when you consider how unreal my life can be. It had barely reached 10 a.m. when I heard a knocking at the door, the letterbox rattling, fingers flapping through it, voices calling out to me on the doorstep. It was Luke and Clyde. They'd missed their bus, for reasons I won't go into now, but it involved an extraterrestrial warlord disguised as a kitten. Don't ask. And they'd come back home in the hope that I might be able to drive them there instead. Not that they told me that at first, but I could tell. Teenage boys aren't exactly the subtlest of creatures. That's what I meant about surprises. Suddenly, on a Saturday morning, I found myself confronted with the prospect of a long drive to Wales, to a world of mountains and tea shops and country lanes, and I wasn't going to refuse. To be honest, I quite liked the idea of a day away from Ealing, and I knew how much this field trip meant to Luke. But there was still one problem. Getting there. "Haven't you got any directions?" I asked hopefully. Clyde just grinned. "Better than that," he whooped, pulling a small grey box from his pocket and holding it out to me like some newfound holy relic. It was his mum's sat-nav. Luke had reprogrammed it once before, during an incident with a berserker, and now it could lock onto any mobile phone number in the world and track it cross-country, apparently. "All we have to do is program in Rani's number," Luke explained. "We can follow the coach every step of the way." I couldn't help but be impressed. Sometimes Luke can be quite brilliant. But he also has some pretty incredible friends, not just Clyde, but Rani too. She's his other best friend. They look out for him when he's away from me at school, and we all look out for each other when we're, well, you know. And if you don't know, you're about to find out. We have adventures, you see, the four of us, together. Sometimes they can be a little dangerous, sometimes very dangerous. But we're always watching each other's backs, looking out for one another, best friends, the perfect team. If it weren't for the fact that Rani's father is also the headmaster, I'm pretty sure she'd have been on my doorstep that morning too. So I packed an old sleeping bag and a change of clothes into a rucksack. And before you knew it, we were on our way to Wales, looking forward to getting away for the weekend. Away from Ealing, and away from real life. The Sarah Jane Adventures, The Shadow People, by Scott Handcock, read by Elisabeth Sladen. The car journey was the usual excitement of traffic jams and petrol stations, at least until we made it out of Greater London. Then it was pretty much plain sailing along the M4, a nice, leisurely drive. The boys played travel games in the back, making names out of licence plates, that sort of thing. Anything they could find to pass the time. And soon enough, we found ourselves crossing the Severn Bridge, driving across the border into Wales. And the views there as we drove deeper and deeper into the valleys were just, well, they were just incredible. Lush green grass stretching out as far as the eye could see, rock formations, streams, lakes, waterfalls, mountains looming over us as we drove through the valleys, their snow-capped peaks wreathed in powder-white cloud, shooting high into the skies above our heads. Beautiful, breathtaking, and there was no sign of civilization. Not for miles. I mean, occasionally we might spot the odd cottage or two, nestled cosily away in the wilderness, or we might pass through a village, Just a handful of houses, a tiny little community tucked away from the rest of the world, happy to make do with little more than a corner shop, some tea shops, and a public house. All fairly traditional, and a far cry from our life in the city. But then, as we dipped over a hillock, I spotted a more familiar sight ahead, no more than a quarter of a mile or so away, at least according to the sat-nav. It was the school coach, broken down in a lay-by, a few of the other parents still skulking in the fields, stretching their legs. "Looks like someone needs our help," Clyde commented. As I felt my own car start to struggle and splutter beneath the wheel, I could feel it in my hands, under my feet, the whole car resisting my control. I checked the dashboard. The petrol tank was still half full. None of the hazard lights was flashing. Then, when we were just a few hundred metres away from the others, the car ground to an abrupt halt, causing us to lurch forward in our seats. I twisted the key in the ignition, but nothing happened. Then I tried a second time. Not so much as a splutter. The dashboard lights weren't flashing to tell me that something was wrong, and yet it just wouldn't work. I leapt out of the car, frustrated, the boys clambering out the back to join me. "Anything we can do to help, Mum?" Luke asked. "I wouldn't have thought so," I said, walking round to the bonnet. "Tell you what, you can take the bags over to the others if you like." "Sure thing, Sarah Jane," Clyde grinned, saluting. I watched as they hauled our luggage from the boot, carrying it off towards the coach. When I was sure no one was looking, I slipped the sonic lipstick from my pocket and gave the engine a quick little zap. But there was nothing. So I tried again, and again, and again. Hopeless. Then I heard footsteps on the rocky road behind me, a stern yet friendly voice calling out, "Sarah Jane?" I slipped the sonic lipstick back inside my coat and turned to see Rani's father, Haresh, strolling down the lane towards me, covered in grime. "Nice to see you. Glad you could make it," he smiled. "You should have told me you were coming. I would have given you a lift." "It was a last-minute decision," I told him quickly. "Spur-of-the-moment thing." "Ah," he nodded, reading between the lines. "You with us all week, then?" "At this rate, it certainly looks that way," I joked, nodding back towards the car. "But no, I'm just here for tonight. Then back to Bannerman Road, first thing in the morning. Fingers crossed. Too much to do. You know how it is." He laughed. "Oh, tell me about it." I smiled back politely, not saying a word. Small talk wasn't my strong point. "Oh, well," I said eventually, turning towards the others, "I really should catch up with the boys. We had quite a journey. You wouldn't believe how stuffy it gets in that little car of mine. And I think a quick little jaunt in the fresh Welsh air might do us the world of good." "Of course," Haresh nodded. "Don't let me stop you. Take Rani with you if you like. We went on a little wander earlier with some of the other kids, but I'm sure she'd like an opportunity to explore a little further. Especially since we've still not got that blasted engine running again. It's like we're in some sort of radar black spot. Haven't been able to get through to anyone. So it's just me and some of the other dads trying to work our mechanical magic. Surprised you managed to find us, to be honest." He paused, that awkward silence hanging in the air between us, yet again. "Anyway, look, why don't you go for a wander?" he suggested. "The others should be back by 4:30, by which point we'll hopefully be on our way again. Is that going to be long enough for you?" "Oh, absolutely," I agreed, glancing idly at my wristwatch, not quite registering how late it was. And as I set off for the others, I heard Rani's father call back after me, "See you later. Oh, and don't let Clyde Langer cause you any trouble." Of course, by the time I caught up with the others, they'd already decided amongst themselves where they wanted to go. So Rani took command, leading us across the grassy plains, up a hillock, the four of us struggling to remain on our feet as we hiked further and further, higher and higher, one slow, steady step at a time. "There's something I want to show you," Rani said as we stepped over a ridge. "Dad found it earlier. What do you reckon?" We looked down into the valleys deep beneath us, and there, nestling in the heart of the basin, was the most beautiful lake you've ever seen. Its waters the purest blue, calm and still. It must have been at least half a mile across. "It's incredible," Luke sighed, trying to take it all in. "Isn't it just?" I agreed, wrapping an arm around him, pulling him close. "Come on, what do you say we take a closer look?" There wasn't any argument, and the four of us trotted down the slopes towards the lake. We could feel the crunch of the gravel beneath our feet, hear the water lapping as the waves rippled out. Children were skimming stones on the other side of the lake. "They were doing that earlier," Rani laughed. "Typical boys." But her laugh was somehow hollow, and I caught her glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, as though she half expected to see something behind us. And I wasn't the only one to notice. "Is everything all right?" Luke asked. "Yeah, of course," Rani blustered. "Why shouldn't it be?" But I could see it in her eyes. She was hiding something from us. Rani was scared. "Oh, all right," she sighed, finally giving in. "There was something, but I don't know what it was, all right? It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, or something." Rani told us how she'd been sitting by the lake with her father, watching the boys skim stones, when suddenly she heard a voice, quietly calling out to her, hushed and rasping. "It will be all right." She said it had been like someone whispering in her ear, but when she turned, there was nobody there. No one except her father. Then she caught sight of a reflection in the water, just out of the corner of her eye, some kind of figure standing over her, difficult to make out at first. But again, when she looked round, there was no one there. She could only see it in the surface of the water. As she studied it more closely, Rani finally realised who the mysterious figure was. It was herself, or at least it looked like her, a second Rani crouching over her own reflection, watching her with shining eyes that glowed blood-red, burning into her own, fixing her where she sat. Rani could scarcely believe what she was seeing, and yet the figure was still little more than a dark shape on the water, a silhouette reflected on its surface, a shadow cast against reality. Then a pebble skimmed across the surface of the lake, rippling the once calm waters, distorting Rani's image. She could still see those awful crimson orbs staring at her, even as the waters rocked beneath her. But when they calmed, and Rani could see her own reflection once again, the vision had vanished. The strange apparition was nowhere to be seen. There was nothing there. "Any witnesses?" I asked, but Rani shook her head. "No one else saw a thing," she said quietly. "It's weird because I can't quite shake this feeling, like there's someone still out there, you know? Like there's someone watching us." The boys looked round, scanning the wilderness, and a shiver ran down my spine. I could feel it too, a sensation I'd experienced many times before, and one I've learnt never to ignore. It's difficult to describe, a feeling of intense dread, as though you're being watched, like there's someone or something in the room with you. Most of the time, it's only your imagination, your mind playing tricks. But sometimes... Anyway, Rani was right. I knew it. Not that I told them that. I didn't want to alarm them after all. But there was definitely something out there with us, some kind of force studying our party. But why? I glanced at my watch. It was nearly past, time for us to be heading back. We had a headmaster to keep on the right side of, and it's not like I could just phone to let him know where we were. When we arrived back at the camp, the coach was still refusing to start, and we could hear Rani's father shouting through the valleys. "Come on, everyone! It's 4:25, time's marching on!" And as it turned out, we had only just made it back in time for a head count. There were a few stragglers, there always are, but everyone was quickly accounted for. "Right then," Mr. Chandra bellowed. "Looks like we're going to have to make do here for the night. Now, we're only going to have another half hour or two of sunlight, so we need to start pitching tents. I suggest you work in pairs and no messing around. Understood?" He turned to our little group. "Luke, Clyde, you can help Sarah Jane. Rani, you might need to give me a hand with mine. Oh, you're useless, you are, Rani teased. Oi! He turned to the rest of us, clapping his hands together. Oh, come on, he barked. Haven't got all day, far from it. And he was right. Already the sun was starting to dip behind the mountain tops, bathing the entire sky in a stunning haze of amber light, a burning orange sphere picked out against the purple clouds. Only on Earth. I watched as Luke and Clyde pitched their tents together, then made my way around to the other children, helping where I could, standing well back where I couldn't. Then I heard a voice on the wind calling out to me. It was asking for help, close to my ear, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I paused for a second, waiting for the voice to call again. But it never did. Does anybody need my help? I asked, trying to make myself heard above the chatter of children, the clatter of tent poles. No one even acknowledged me. They all just went about their business. Then I caught sight of a figure out of the corner of my eye. It was standing in the distance, not too far from Rani and her father, its eyes blazing red, just as Rani had described. Yet when I tried to look at it full on, it vanished, gone in the blink of an eye. I looked around, but there was no sign of the mystery figure, whatever it was, so I made my way over to where Rani and Haresh were struggling with their own tents, a good way away from the rest of the group. Headmaster's privileges. I made out that everything was going according to plan, that all the kids were managing their tents, which they were, and that I wanted the chance to catch up with Haresh about Luke's progress in school. He was more than happy to oblige. In reality, however, I had hoped to confide in Rani about what I'd seen, that mysterious figure, those strange, angry eyes. But Rani was distracted. She kept glancing over her shoulder again, back towards her father, then at the others, as though she was scared of being noticed. And when I tried to talk to her, she shrugged me off again and again. Not now, she insisted. Not with Dad here, before vanishing back inside her tent. I'd never seen her act like this before. Not once, in all our adventures together. She normally relished the excitement and the secrecy, but now she seemed strangely on edge, always insistent that now wasn't a good time. In the end, I relented and left her alone, heading back to track down Luke and Clyde. At least they'd listen to me, I thought. But when I found them, it was my turn to feel on edge, because standing there with them, helping them put up their tents, was Rani. She'd come over to them 20 minutes earlier, long before I left her and her father, which could only mean... I turned back the way I came and peered across the campsite to the Chandra tents. Rani was nowhere to be seen, only Haresh, still struggling under a complex pyramid of tent poles and canvas. And then, behind him, just a short distance away, that same shady figure, the one with the crimson eyes. "Do you want to take a look inside?" Rani asked cheerfully, holding open the flaps to my tent, inviting me in. But I couldn't answer her. My throat was dry, and I couldn't make a sound, let alone speak. Instead, I just smiled and nodded, following her and the others inside. I was still unable to shake that sensation Rani had mentioned before, that feeling of being watched, of someone else's eyes monitoring your every move, just waiting. Not long afterwards, we heard the call for dinner, and the boys started unpacking their supplies. As part of the field trip, each of the children had been called upon to devise a simple menu for the week, a series of meals that could be cooked on camping stoves and, more importantly, would be edible, regardless of their culinary skill. "Don't worry, Sarah Jane," Clyde grinned. "Tonight's dinner's on me. Whatever you want, your wish is my command." I looked at him, not entirely convinced. "Really?" I asked. "Really?" he replied. "My mum says I'm a demon in the kitchen, doesn't she, Luke?" "Yes," Luke agreed. "But we're not in the kitchen, we're in a tent." Yeah, Clyde sighed. "And I'm not an actual demon either. Boy, have you still got a long way to go." Rani laughed. "I think this is where I definitely go and help Dad." she said, crawling back outside. "Less chance of food poisoning there. See you later." "See you," we yelled after her. Then Luke and I both turned to look at Clyde. Packet of pasta in one hand, a tin can in the other, and a mischievous gleam in his eye. "Spag bol, anyone?" he grinned. An hour or so later, after a surprisingly filling supper courtesy of Clyde, followed by a round of washing up and rinsing in the nearby stream, everybody gathered round the campfire before bed. We even had marshmallows as we huddled up to one another on the grass. And of course, no campfire session would be complete without the obligatory ghost story or two. We went round the group one by one. The kids told of things they'd seen in films or stories they'd made up by themselves on the spot, usually a little too gory for my taste. Then one of them claimed to have actually seen a ghost back home, prompting a more serious discussion amongst the group. "Have you ever seen a ghost, Mum?" Luke asked. I smiled. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," I told him, "but never a ghost. At least, I don't think I have." Half the group groaned in disappointment. "Well, that's not to say I haven't seen things that were similar," I added, trying to regain their attention. There was this one time I was visiting a friend in Romania and I saw, well, I'm not sure I can say. Rani leant forward. "What happened?" It was the middle of the night, I remembered. I was staying in this big old house in the middle of nowhere, all stuffed bears and suits of armour, when the clock struck 3 a.m. and I woke with a start. Can't remember why now. But then there was a noise, this terrible wailing, screaming from the walls. The room went ice cold, and a bright white light filled my eyes. There was a figure, tall and slim, just standing in the corner of the room, watching me. And I was terrified. My heart was racing, blood pumping. Then it stopped, and the most frightening thing of all was not being able to explain it. A hush fell across the group as they digested my story. "That is so cool!" Clyde exclaimed, breaking the silence. "Did you ever find out what it was?" Rani asked. "Oh, yes," I said. "And what was it?" I smiled. That would be telling. But it wasn't a ghost. Who knows? Maybe one day I'll see one. Until then, I think there's a scientific explanation for most things. You just have to look for it. The kids groaned again. "There are still all sorts of stories, though," I continued, reclaiming their attention. "Fables of Snowdonia that have yet to be explained." "Really?" Rani's father raised a suspicious eyebrow, clearly wondering where I was going with this, and I momentarily questioned whether it was really my place to encourage them. In the end, I decided it was. "Oh, yes," I replied. "This place has quite a history, dating back hundreds of years, if not thousands. Druids and Romans, and quite a few interesting cults and creatures that the historical records neglect to mention." "Like what, miss?" asked one of the younger kids. Suddenly, I had them hanging on my every word, and I wasn't sure what to say. Truth is, I was making most of it up. It's second nature. In my life, you get used to adjusting the truth. And in this case, I needed a way to talk with Luke, Clyde and Rani without any of the other children becoming suspicious. I knew there wouldn't be any time after lights out, so ghost stories seemed the next best way of doing it. And it wasn't like I was lying. Not really, I was just telling different truths. "There are always stories," I told them, "wherever you go. Local legends of monsters that stalk the woods at night, or lights in the skies, strange and beautiful, vanishing without a trace. And that never changes. Out here in the middle of nowhere, or back in the city, in London, there will always be stories. But that doesn't mean to say there really aren't things out there," I continued, directing my gaze onto Luke, Clyde and Rani. Not that they seemed to realise it at first. "Because there are always things we can never quite explain, everywhere we go, and you learn that more and more as you get older. But here..." I threw my arms open to the chilly air around us, gesturing out towards the mountains looming over us. Here, there's no one to explain things. In fact, for all we know, we might have been the first people to stay in this spot for years. And it might be there's a reason for that. It might be no one else will come here because they know what's waiting for them if they do. I broke off, letting a hush fall, as all the children stared at me, transfixed. "What sort of things?" Clyde asked eventually. "Things you wouldn't believe," I told him. I was really getting into my stride by this point. "They speak of creatures that prowl the wilds of Snowdonia, feasting on the night. Creatures that just watch and wait, biding their time. And they could be watching any one of you, right now." Again the kids fell silent as I looked around the group, and I even caught a few of them glancing over their shoulders, and the relief on their faces when they realized there wasn't anybody there. Eventually, Rani broke the silence. "And these creatures," she asked, "what do they do exactly?" "Do?" I asked. "They don't do anything, not as such. They just watch us, study us. Then they become us." My eyes were fixed on Rani the entire time, watching her like a hawk. "They steal people's personalities," I went on. "Every minute detail. Their appearance, their mannerism, any nervous little tics they might have, things we wouldn't even notice. They can copy." "Doppelgangers, then," Clyde interrupted. "Like in that film, am I right?" "Yes, that's exactly the sort of thing," I agreed. I wasn't entirely sure which film Clyde was on about. "Creatures that take on the form of others, creatures not of this world, or creatures we've long since forgotten about." I slipped into a theatrical whisper to round the story off. "And they could be any one of us." I felt a speck of rain splash lightly against my cheek as the children huddled together. Rani's father must have felt it too, a light drizzle forming in the air around us. "Right then," he said, rising to his feet. "I think it's time we drew this to a close. Got a long day tomorrow, so I think it's time everyone made their way to bed, don't you?" But, sir," one of the older kids protested, "it's only 9:30. "Yes," agreed Mr. Chandra. "I don't doubt for a second most of you are going to be up all night anyway, carrying on with these ridiculous stories. So come on." He clapped his hands together sharply, and the kids started shifting reluctantly where they sat. Standing up and stretching awkwardly, they headed back to their tents, out of the rain. For many reasons, I struggled to sleep that night. Perhaps it was the ill-fitting sleeping bag, or the lumpy ground digging in beneath me. Maybe it was the strangeness of all the sounds around me, the sounds of nature I'd forgotten even existed, muffled by the storm that raged outside. Maybe not. The rain grew heavier, beating down across the outer layers of my tent. The ground squelched beneath me as I tossed and turned. I could hear the wind, too, whistling through the valleys like a song buffeting the canvas, causing the entire tent to shudder and shake around me. And there were voices, kids chattering excitedly to one another, trying not to be heard, hushed tones quietly escaping from their tents, slowly dwindling as they resigned themselves to sleep, childish voices echoing around my head. But something had unsettled me. I could feel it, a tightness round my chest, my heart beating ever so slightly faster than it should have been. I'd seen something out there in the wilderness, but I didn't know what. I couldn't tell the others, not without evidence, and certainly not at that time of night. After all those campfire stories, their dreams were probably full of more than enough monsters and ghosts without me throwing a real one into the mix. No, this time I had to keep it to myself, at least until morning. All I could do was to stay awake and alert for as long as possible, listening out for anything unusual. The minutes passed so slowly, they felt like hours. Then, a little after midnight, I heard a voice inside my tent. A voice I didn't recognize, but one so calm, so sure of itself, it terrified me. "It will be all it hissed. It was as if something was whispering in my ear right beside me. I couldn't bear to look, not for minutes. I was frozen to the spot. I knew there was no one in there with me. There couldn't be. But it sounded so close, so real. I didn't know what else it could have been. It was just a voice inside my head. Then I became aware of something moving outside my tent. An unearthly glow was pouring through the canvas, pale and orange and pulsating. After everything I'd seen here on Earth and out amongst the stars, I knew there had to be a rational explanation for all this. Perhaps it was some of the kids messing around in the middle of the night, trying to scare each other with torches. Then again, maybe it was just what I hoped it wouldn't be. Something else. Something I couldn't explain. A creature from another world hunting us in the middle of that cold night. As the light grew brighter, I thought I saw the faintest trace of a shape forming in front of it. A dark, slender figure with thin arms stretching out towards me. Then suddenly it dropped to the ground, as though listening for something, its head twisting back and forth, scouring the campsite. Moments later it started moving again, creeping closer towards my tent. I thought I could hear its breathing, heavy and urgent. Or was that just me? As I watched, both the figure and the strange unearthly glow behind it vanished. I lay stock still, just waiting for something to happen, for the shape to reappear, or something worse. But all I could hear was the wind outside and the blood pumping through my ears, slowing as I eventually relaxed. Whatever had been out there, whatever thing was stalking us, it had gone. Then I heard a short, sharp crack, the snap of a twig just outside my tent, and the zip to my tent began to rise. Something on the outside was determined to get in. I shuffled towards the parting tent flaps, frantically trying to pull them shut, but it was too late. The zip had already been pulled wide open, canvas billowing wildly against the elements as a dark figure appeared in the entranceway. I fell backwards onto the sleeping bag, my hands scrambling through the covers all around me, looking for something, anything to defend myself with. All the time, my breathing hard and ragged, adrenaline pumping through me. Then I felt an overwhelming sense of relief as the torch beam was switched on, and a familiar figure popped his head inside the tent. I let out an elated sob, the first sound I dared to make in minutes. It was Luke. His hair was ruffled, beaten out of shape by the wind outside. He crawled inside the tent on all fours and scurried up beside me, sitting close by as I relaxed. I couldn't sleep, he told me. This place, it's nothing like home. He rocked back and forth relentlessly, as if it was all too much for him. Come here, I said quietly, wrapping a motherly arm around his damp T-shirt. His head rested lightly on my shoulder. That thing you were talking about earlier, he whispered. What do you think it could be? Oh, that was just a story, I said. Something I made up to try to scare you. I wouldn't pay any attention to it. You've seen it, though, haven't you? He asked eventually. That's why you mentioned it back there, isn't it? And it's not just you. Rani's seen it. She said so. I sighed. I don't know what we saw, I said, trying to be as honest as I could. The mind can play funny games with you sometimes, especially when you're somewhere new, somewhere you're not familiar with. But you must have seen things, he continued. When you travelled with the doctor, you must have seen creatures that can take on other forms. Shapeshifters or clones or something. Do you think that's what this might be? And what's it doing here anyway? Out in the middle of nowhere? Mom? I smiled, but I didn't say a word. As usual, Luke wanted to learn, to understand the world around him. Not just this world either. He had 1,000,001 questions, all of them fresh and bright and new. But I didn't have any answers. Not this time. We sat there for a minute or two, just holding one another in silence, listening to the sounds of the storm outside. And I yawned. Couldn't help it. And Luke shifted beside me, kissing me gently on the cheek. Night, Mum, he said, disappearing through the tent flaps as quickly as he'd arrived. back into the storm outside, taking his torch with him. It was going to get soaked. I crawled across to the front of the tent, poking my head out to offer him a coat. But Luke was nowhere to be seen. Yet in the darkness, I could see something. 2 red lights in the distance, shining through the rain. It was those eyes again, burning into me. As I watched, they seemed to grow wider, staring directly at me. If the eyes belonged to a human figure, I couldn't make it out. It was as if it was cast in shadow from the neck down, everything concealed in darkness. I must have sat there for several minutes, just watching the eyes, entranced by their stillness. Not once, in all that time, did they so much as flinch or twitch, not a hint of movement. And then they vanished. I waited a long time for them to reappear, but they seemed to be gone for good. Eventually I went back to bed, fastening the zips securely, closing my eyes tight and trying to convince myself it had all been a trick of my imagination. But as I tried to sleep, all I could see were those 2 red orbs boiling in their sockets, shining blotches of red now swimming inside my eyelids. Eventually I must have fallen asleep, because the next morning I was woken by a voice outside. "Psst, Sarah Jane!" It was Clyde. I struggled to come round at first, fumbling against my belongings, looking for my watch. 5:30 a.m. It was barely even light yet. "Sarah Jane, you in there? It's me!" I struggled out of my sleeping bag and crawled to the front of the tent, poking my head outside. And there was Clyde waiting for me, already dressed. "Clyde," I whispered, "have you any idea what time it is?" "Nope," he said, shaking his head. "But something strange is going on. 'Cause I just woke up, yeah? And I couldn't see Luke anywhere. I've looked around the campsite. I even tried his mobile, but there's still no signal." I disappeared back inside the tent. "Sarah Jane!" Clyde called to me again. "2 ticks, I told him. Just get me some shoes on." I probably got dressed faster that morning than I ever have before, and within a minute I was back outside that tent, watch, phone, and sonic lipstick all to hand. I dialed Luke's number on my phone and held it to my ear. "I've already tried that," Clyde protested, but I shushed him. His phone hadn't received an upgrade from a sonic lipstick after all. "Hold on, I think there's something there," I told him. Then I heard a crackle on the other end. Had someone answered? "Luke!" I cried. And for a split second I thought I heard his voice, but it was distorted, faint, swamped by static and crackling, and a strange sequence of bleeps and chirrups. And even though I could make out random snatches of Luke on the other end, it was clear he couldn't hear me. I hung up. "Something must be interfering with the signal," I told Clyde. "But at least there is a signal. All we have to do now is follow it." "And how are we supposed to do that?" Clyde asked. "It could be just about anywhere. And it's not like we've got an alien supercomputer on hand to help us out." "Maybe not," I smiled. "But I think we might have something just as useful. Wait here." I ran back towards the road, quick as I could, heading for the car. I tugged Carla's sat-nav from the windscreen. I switched it on. There was still a good hour or so of charge left in it, more than enough time to track Luke down. Clyde came racing after me. I should have known he wouldn't listen. "What are you doing?" he asked, struggling for breath between each syllable. "Just programming Luke's number into your mum's sat-nav," I explained, "and giving it a little boost with this." I pulled the sonic lipstick from my pocket, aiming it at the little grey box and zapping it, prompting a smooth female voice to purr through its tinny little speakers. "In 500 metres, turn left." "There," I grinned. "We can track Luke's phone with this. But first things first, we'll need Rani to cover for us while we're gone. Oh, and remind me to sonic all your phones in future. It'll make life a lot easier." Clyde ran back to the camp to save time, catching me up just a few minutes later. His cheeks were red, flushed through running, and just a hint of embarrassment. "Was Rani okay with everything?" I asked. "Yeah," Clyde panted. "In the end, anyway. Got her tent confused with someone else's. Took quite a bit of blagging, but I think I got away with it." I couldn't help but laugh. "You got the wrong tent." Yeah, I know," Clyde muttered. "Not my fault. They all look the same." "Anyway, Shouldn't we be looking for our Lukey boy? He could be anywhere out there. Or around his cool to cover for us. Clyde was right. We didn't have time for teasing. But I still made a quick mental note to mention it to the others when we saw them. I held the sat-nav out in front of us, like some kind of high-tech divining rod, the pair of us obeying its instructions to the letter. According to its data, Luke couldn't be more than a mile or so away by road, maybe even less as the crow flew. But we hadn't counted on having mountains and valleys to contend with, and an awful lot of climbing as a result. We clambered up the slopes, along cliff-top paths and muddy plains, when suddenly Clyde spotted something on the horizon. "Look!" he whispered, his arm jutting out ahead of us, pointing towards the lake. There was a figure at the water's edge. At first we couldn't make its identity out. It could have been anyone or anything. But as we drew nearer, it became obvious who was standing there. I recognised the clothes, the trainers, the dark, scruffy hair. It was Luke. At least it looked like him. I consulted the sat-nav. According to this, I told Clyde quietly as I could, Luke's still another half a mile or so to the east. "Correction," Clyde said smugly. "Luke's phone is another half mile or so to the east. Maybe he dropped it. Wouldn't be the first time. Come on!" I wasn't necessarily convinced by Clyde's theory, but there wasn't any time to argue with him either. He was already running on ahead, far faster than I could move. And, I had to admit, the facts were staring us in the face. There was Luke, my own son, standing by the lake. I'd have recognised him anywhere. And yet, something was wrong. As I approached the boys, Luke ran up to me, a broad, excited grin spreading across his face. "Oh, Mum, I'm so sorry," he said, throwing his arms around me. "I just had to come up here because I realised something last night after we talked. I theorised what the creature might be, why it's here, and I needed to know whether I'm right or not." "And were you?" I asked. "I'm not sure yet," Luke admitted, almost hesitating as he said it. "But I found something you should see. Come on." And with that, Luke started running off in the opposite direction, gesturing for Clyde and me to follow him. But I held back just for a second, just long enough to confirm my suspicions with the sat-nav. Luke was heading to the source of the original signal, back to where we thought he'd been all the time, back into the mountains. Maybe Clyde was right and he'd been up there before. Maybe he had dropped his phone. I just wasn't sure. After another 10 minutes of climbing the slopes, we reached a flat, rocky area halfway up the mountain. A perfect place to rest. So we sat there for a minute or two, the sun just starting to glimmer above the mountains, bursting above their peaks. "This is what I brought you here to see," Luke smiled. "Oh, and this." We turned and saw him standing in the entrance to a cave set deep within the rock. "Come on," he said again, throwing his arms wide across the gloom. "What do you think?" Clyde and I followed him into the darkness of the cave. It was dank and cold, the rocky walls slimy to the touch, and the further we walked, the more I became aware of a light bleeding out from beneath the rock, seeping through the cracks, as though it was somehow emanating from within the mountain. Some kind of phosphorescence, perhaps. It was coupled with a gentle buzzing sensation, beating through the walls, the gentle, steady hum of technology. "Sarah Jane," Clyde yelled, "check out these walls!" I moved to where he was standing and ran the palm of my hand across the surface of the wall. It was still cold and wet, no change there, but it also felt strangely smooth, polished. There were ridges cut into the rock at regular intervals, and I could feel it, energy pulsing through me. "It's some kind of spaceship, isn't it?" Luke asked. "I was right, wasn't I?" "Yes," I said. "But this one looks like it was grown, not built." I pulled out my sonic lipstick and ran it over the wall ahead of me, listening out to its subtle tweets and chirrups. "Some kind of organic technology, then," Luke replied, running his hands along another wall. "How long do you think it's been here?" "I'm not sure," I said, checking the special readings on my watch. The mountain must have formed around it where it crashed. If it did crash, that is. What? Clyde scoffed. You're telling me an entire mountain grew around a spaceship? How long would that take? Oh, you'd be surprised, I told him. But then I'd seen things like this before. Technology like this has a habit of influencing the environment around it, accelerating things. And it's not just a spaceship anymore, Luke added. It's part of the landscape. It's been here longer than any of us. So what's down there, then? Clyde asked, pointing down the corridor. But I didn't answer. I just took their hands in mine, leading them both further into the cave, deeper into the bowels of the mountain. My curiosity always did get the better of me. Come on, I whispered, but be careful. For all we know, this could still be a trap. The three of us tiptoed down the passage, holding out our hands in front of our faces, shielding our eyes from the light as it grew brighter and brighter still. As we rounded a corner, we found ourselves inside a massive control room, dwarfed by the technology around us, panels flickering and chirping on every available surface. The entire room mimicked the shape of the mountain, the walls of the chamber sloping inwards to form a peak, 50 or 60 meters above our heads. We were now in the very heart of the spaceship. But even that wasn't the most remarkable sight that confronted us, because standing at one of the control panels was a familiar figure, totally engrossed in the information on the screens in front of him, wearing his favorite dinosaur t-shirt and jeans, his denim jacket draped across a console. It was... Luke! Clyde yelled, running towards the figure. What's going on? How can you be there? And yet... This second Luke spun round, a huge, excited grin spreading across his face. The kind of grin that always tells me he's found something, and he can't wait to tell us about it. Clyde, he said. Then his smile faltered when he saw the other figure we'd come in with. And sure enough, there he was, still looking exactly like Luke. Same clothes, same hair, same everything. Until that very moment, when his once blue eyes suddenly turned a furious shade of red, like the eyes I'd seen in the night. At the console, the real Luke hesitated, trying to find the right words. But there never were right words, not for this. Is that really me? The words kept trapping in my throat. I couldn't speak. Unfortunately, Clyde could. Luke Smith, he joked. Allow me to introduce Luke Smith. The two Lukes simply stared at one another from across the chamber, each taken aback by the other's presence there. It's a strange experience, being confronted by something that looks just like you, and I should know. Immediately, I was on the defensive, gathering my two boys behind me, stepping up to confront the other Luke. Why did you bring us here? I demanded, struggling to regain my composure. It's not easy when you're confronted by something like that. A creature in the shape of a loved one. Your own son. The other Luke just looked at me with those same puppy dog eyes I'd grown so used to. All right, they were still glowing red, but somehow they seemed just the same as they'd always been, pleading with me. Eventually, he spoke, his voice almost cracking. Mum, please. Don't you dare call me that, I told him, holding the real Luke close next to me. This is my son. This is the real Luke Smith. Now tell me, who are you? The other Luke's head dropped slowly down, as though somehow ashamed. He kicked at his heels like a kid getting told off, retreating inside himself. Itself. Then he threw his head back sharply, those red eyes fixed on each of us as they flared again brighter and brighter. They began to consume him, washing over his body until, after a few seconds, all we could see was a silhouette like I'd encountered before, marked out against a halo of crimson light. Not Luke, then? It whispered through the pain, its voice still shifting. How about this? The silhouette threw its arms open, and we watched, fascinated, as the light behind it began to fade, pouring back into the creature. The other Luke had vanished, and in his place was another familiar figure. Clyde.
Is this okay?
The creature asked again.
Always easy being the Joker, isn't that right,
Clyde.
And if I call you Sarah Jane in this form, well, you can't object to that, surely.
He may have got his looks down to a T, but it didn't really sound like Clyde at all. Perhaps it needed more practice. You stop this right now, I barked. But the other Clyde just smiled.
Oh, what?
He asked.
You forget, I'm Clyde Langer. I know all about you, what you do, how you always strive to be fair and just. No guns, remember?
He turned to the real Clyde.
Doesn't that get a bit boring?
You'd think, Clyde shrugged before adding, by the way, do I really sound like that? No, Luke teased. You're worse. So, come on, I asked the figure again, this time more forcefully. What are you?
That's just it.
The other Clyde laughed.
I don't know. Or at least, I didn't. I never even knew I existed, not for years. That's why I need you, each of you, because only you can truly show me what I am.
It's some sort of empathic artificial entity, interrupted Luke. I've been studying the logs. It was created by a race of intergalactic voyagers, pioneers, the Shaydargen. Apparently, I racked my brains for any memory of the Shaydargen and their kind, but they were a new one on me. Never heard of them.
I was created,
the other Clyde continued,
for one purpose and one purpose alone, to meet the needs of the crew, my masters. Every thought, every whim, my purpose was to get inside their heads, to understand their needs so I could cater for them, and they longed for nothing, not in all their years of travel amongst the stars.
So to do that, you had to become them, I realised. Not just one, but all of them.
Yeah, the other Clyde said simply. I can get inside the head of anyone I come in contact with. And that includes you, Sarah Jane. Even now, even as we're speaking.
He smiled as though he knew what I was thinking. So, what happened to you? The real Clyde interrupted. How'd you end up here? And what happened to those things anyway?
The Shaydargen made planet fall on Earth millennia ago.
You mean they crashed? Clyde asked.
The impact of their ship formed the valley below, and so they settled here, away from people. They didn't do any harm, just kept themselves to themselves. They spent the rest of their lives here, till eventually each of them, they died.
And with no one to serve, you ceased to exist too, am I right? I asked. The other Clyde just nodded, sudden sadness sweeping across his eyes.
I felt them die, he said. They just slip away, each of them. No warning, never any warning. And every time one of them passed away, I felt myself grow weaker as I lost my connection with them. Where once I'd been a crew of 10, I became a crew of 9, then 8, and I just dwindled, becoming fewer and fewer as it fell. Till eventually, I was just one man. But they all died happy. I made sure of it.
He paused.
That was my purpose, after all.
Until with no crew to serve, you ceased to exist too, I suggested. And the other Clyde nodded again. But why come back now, after all these years?
Because you woke me,
he answered simply.
The ship draws its power from the landscapes, the wind, the waterfalls, even those primitive mechanical vehicles you're so fond of.
Immediately I knew what he meant. The school trip, of course. That's why the coach stopped working when it did. It was this ship. And with all those minds stranded here, teasing at your consciousness.
I was created to meet the needs of those around me, but I've been asleep for so long, I no longer knew what I was or why I was here. I assumed I was just another one of them. So I watched them from afar, following them to the water's edge, trying to work out where I belonged. I watched as they built their makeshift dwellings.
His eyes met mine.
I even spoke with some of them.
I remembered the words both Rani and I had heard.
It will be all right.
Now I realised it was the figure's way of saying it was going to serve us and make us happy. Well, we're very sorry to have disturbed you, I said, ushering Luke and Clyde back towards the entrance. But now we've helped you realise what you are, we really should be going. Nice to have met you. But the other Clyde ran out in front of us, blocking the passageway. His eyes began to burn that deep, dark red once more.
You can't leave,
he cried.
You can never leave. Don't you understand?
I understood the situation all too well. This creature, this entity, whatever it was, had taken on the body of a frightened youngster, and he knew if he let us go, he might never exist again. He'd just stop.
If you stay here, I can make you happy,
the other Clyde promised, the tone of his voice becoming all the more manic.
That's my function, you see. I'm here to look after you, cater for your every need, but I need you to look after me too. Need you to keep me alive.
His eyes met mine, pleading with me for help. But there wasn't any help I could give. I'm sorry, I told him. We have to go.
You can't,
he snapped, throwing some kind of tantrum at me.
You can't!
I sighed. Look, I said again, a plan slowly forming in the back of my mind. I can't begin to understand what you must be feeling right now. But maybe, if you were me, if you took on my form, we could understand each other better. That's right, isn't it? You can take on the form of any one of us, can't you? Why not me? The other Clyde glared at me reluctantly. He couldn't refuse. And we watched again as he threw back his head, eyes blazing, his entire body shimmering in an aura of orange light as he became something else. He became me.
Is this what you wanted?
The other me asked, rolling her neck, testing out her newly formed body. It took a moment or two for me to find the right words. It's unnerving being confronted by an exact duplicate of yourself. It doesn't matter if they're clones or androids or artificially created entities designed to meet your every need. It still feels wrong. You look just like me, I stammered.
I am you,
she corrected cheerily.
I'm you in every way, shape and form. Your personality, your thoughts, your memories.
I smiled. This was precisely what I had hoped for. Then you will know I've committed my life to helping others, I said.
Of course.
So you will also know how much those children out there mean to me. How much Luke means to me.
Oh, yes,
the other Sarah Jane agreed.
He means the world to you, to both of us.
Then you know I would do anything to protect them, I whispered, even if it meant sacrificing my own life to do it. Suddenly her face dropped.
Is that what you want me to do?
The other me asked, realising what I was asking of her.
You want me to let you go? To sacrifice myself? Just like that?
Yes, I said quietly. It's what I'd do, if I had to. Because the decisions we make, they define us. They're what make us the people we are today. And you've never had that. You've only ever been defined by other people. She smiled at me weakly. This is your chance to take control, I urged. You can stay here and make a stand. You can be yourself and let us be ourselves, even if it means you stop existing.
It would be my life, though, wouldn't it?
She asked.
However fleeting.
I nodded.
Then go.
I watched as the other me stepped aside from the passageway, letting Luke and Clyde run on ahead. But I held back with her, just a moment or two longer, just long enough to say, "Thank you." She smiled as I said it, then watched as I pulled the sonic lipstick from my pocket, zapping one of the consoles embedded in the wall. "There," I said. "That should make sure you're not disturbed in the future. Systems should shut down properly in an hour or so. Then you can finally rest, just as the shade Darjan intended." I saw the light flicker from her eyes, and I knew it had already started.
It will be all right,
she said, holding a finger to her lips as she ushered me outside. Luke and Clyde were waiting for me at the entrance to the cavern, and when we returned to the others, we arrived to find the coach ticking over. Everyone else already packing up their things, getting ready to leave. All except Rani, who started running across the fields the moment she saw us. "I tried to stall Dad for as long as I could," she panted, "but I think he might have twigged something was up. What happened back there anyway? Is everyone okay?" "They're more than okay," I smiled, throwing my arm around them, pulling them into a hug. "They're brilliant. You all are." "And what about the thing?" Rani asked again. "I'm assuming there was a thing." "Oh, yes," I grinned. "There was definitely a thing. But I'll leave that for Luke and Clyde to explain. You've still got another 5 days, remember?" I checked my watch. There was another 20 minutes or so before the mountain spaceship shut down its systems permanently. And I could still feel the creature's presence close to me. It was different from before. Not threatening. Just not wanting to be alone when it all ended. I hoped it had made the right decision. That we both had. "Come on," I sighed. "We've all got places we should be." "Are you going then, Mum?" Luke asked. "One night, that's all I promised," I said, and I gave him the biggest hug I could imagine. Clyde and Rani grinned at the pair of us. "Right then," I said. "I don't want to embarrass you any more than I already have, so I'll leave you to it." I paused. "You look after yourself, won't you?" "Yes, Mum," Luke groaned. "And you too," I pointed to Clyde and Rani. "I'll see you both on Friday when you get back, all right?" I gave them a little wave as I strolled back towards the car, the three of them calling after me. "Bye, Mum." "Bye, Sarah Jane." "See you later." I clambered into the seat of my car and let out a massive sigh of relief. Finally, I felt I could relax. Yes, I had a long drive back to London ahead of me, and I would probably hit the congestion zone at rush hour. But then I had a week on my own to catch up on real life. A week without distraction. No noise, no mess, or music. If I'm honest, a very dull week indeed. And even as I pulled away from the lay-by, I knew I couldn't wait for them to return, for the adventures to start again, just as they always did, always would. I smiled as I glanced into my rear-view mirror and saw them standing there, the three of them, waving goodbye. I waved back. And just for a second, I could have sworn I saw myself standing alongside them. The other me, saying a final goodbye before vanishing in the blink of an eye. Forever. As I drove back to Ealing, I was left with that image of the four of us together. It was strangely reassuring. They looked happy, confident and united, as if they were always looking out for one another. The best friends anyone could ever hope to have. The perfect team. My perfect team. The Sarah Jane Adventures, The Shadow People, was written by Scott Handcock and read by Elisabeth Sladen. It was produced for BBC Audiobooks by Neil Gardner.